Okay, let's just start. Amy, would you mind stopping? Right. Okay. So this is wonderful. So this is an welcome all. This is an open Zoom classroom here. So if you choose the gallery view, then you see all the participants in this brown bag. My name is Kerstin Barnt, and I am the director of the Museum Studies program, and I also teach in the German department. Today's Museums at Noon conversation on museum narratives and transitional reputations, history, state legitimacy, and contested heritage in Ukraine and Spain features two recent Museum Studies program graduates and current PhD students, Grace Mahoney and Felix Zamora Gomez. They both began their scholarly journey into the world of museums together in 2016 in the context of the Museum Studies Pro seminar and completed the certificate in 2019. So this is a new format. So we bring two speakers together into these Zoom conversations. And it is especially delightful to have two advanced students today, to welcome two advanced students today back to museum studies who started together in the Museum Studies Pro seminar. In support of their on-site research in Spain and Ukraine, the Museum Studies program awarded Felix and Grace a fellowship for doctoral research on museums, FDRM. And yes, it's going to be a treat to hear about your research and where you are at in your journey towards completing your dissertation. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce both speakers. Grace Mahoney is a PhD candidate in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. Her dissertation, A Visit to the Museum, Literary Memorial Houses and Their Contexts in Russia and Ukraine from 1917 to the present, considers the role of author house museums in the Soviet period as critical and complex institutions of culture that shape memorial and literary paradigms. For her practicum with the Mikhail Bulgakov Memorial Museum in Kiev, Grace successfully implemented a digital collections project that is now hosted at the University of Michigan Library's Digital Contents and Collections. And this is the first of such collaboration. Has it gone live, Grace? So it's live, and so that relationship that you now forged between the Bulgakov Museum and the University of Michigan can be accessed from both sides, from the Ukraine and from here. In her spare time, which she doesn't have much of right at the moment, but it is important to also mention that Grace serves as the managing editor for the Contemporary Ukrainian Poetry series from Lost Horse Press, which published its 6th volume this fall. Felix Zamora Gomez is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. His work focuses on visual culture and the production of historical discourse. He is currently working on his dissertation project entitled Foundational Landscapes on the constitution of a visual regime of history and heritage in 20th century Spain. Studying architecture, museum exhibitions, contemporary art and film, Foundational Landscapes looks at the shifts in the discourse on national heritage and history that underpin the cultural and ideological identity of the Spanish state during the 20th century. In this context, his work is archive-based, and funding from the Museum Studies program supported his research in important Madrid-based institutions, among them the administration's General Archive, the Spanish Agency for International Development and Cooperation, and the Reina Sofia National Museum. And I skipped here one important part because Felix research really studies, it's important to note that Felix research studies ruptures and continuities between Spain's dictatorial and democratic state formation. So welcome to you both. Thank you for agreeing to present your research in progress. And Grace will begin with her presentation.
All right, thank you, Kerstin, and thank you to everyone for being here today. And I'm sharing my screen. Is it working? Yes. Yeah? Okay, great. All right. All right, so I'll be presenting on the Bulgakov Museum because I did a practicum there, but I also am writing a chapter on it for my dissertation. And this is a sub-focus of the chapter and what I'm going to be talking about today. So I first visited the Bulgakov Museum in Kyiv on a snowy day in November 2014. I was struck by the museum's unique exhibition that theatrically staged not only the author's biographic attachment to the residents, but the epoch and characters he brought to life in his writing. As a student interested in the intersections of museums and literature, the Bulgakov Museum seemed an excellent example of the interweaving of the two, and I decided to spend my practicum experience working in and studying the museum. In short, it was a wonderful experience. The small, tight-knit community of the museum embraced me as their own, and I learned a lot about the daily operations and challenges small museums face. One challenge that has come to my attention over the course of studying Bulgakov and his relationship with Kyiv and Ukraine is that it is a contested one. Largely identified with his residence in Moscow and the Russian literary tradition, Bulgakov's association with Kyiv and Ukraine is generally little known. Moreover, the author was not so kind to the Ukrainian national cause that is now very much the center of cultural and political attention in Ukraine today. It's a unique case of a figure who is being celebrated in an environment where he's no longer quite at home, so to speak. As a primary heritage site for Bulgakov in Ukraine today, the museum in Kyiv finds itself as the locus for discussions on the development and curation of culture in the Ukrainian national landscape. In my presentation today, I will briefly contextualize the connection between the museum and its community with information on Bulgakov and his novel, The White Guard, that describes the civil war years in Kyiv following the 1917 Bolshevik revolutions. I will then describe how and why this cultural legacy is viewed as undesirable in Ukraine today. While these are far-reaching and complex issues, given the restrictions on time, I want to spend the bulk of my presentation focusing on what I observe to be the museum's strategies in mitigating their controversial position. How does the museum's mission, exhibition, and programming mediate this undesirable heritage, and strive to serve its community? What are the stakes for the museum and for Ukraine in dealing with the complexities of the past and the challenges of the present? So some context. Born in 1891, Bulgakov spent most of his childhood living with his family on the second floor of House 13 on Andriivsky Descent that they rented in the historic center of Kyiv, which was then part of the Russian Empire. And here you can see a map of the Russian Empire with Kyiv right here. And this is a view of Andriivsky Descent. Andriivsky Descent is an important historic thoroughfare which connects the ancient high ground of the city with the mercantile district of Podil along the river bank. The Bulgakov family belonged to the middle class demographic of Kyiv's Russian intelligentsia. With 4 daughters and 3 sons, the Bulgakov's family photographs relate an elegant, cultured life full of childhood theatrical productions, celebratory gatherings, and leisurely activities. Bulgakov studied medicine at Kyiv University and became a doctor in 1916. He He worked as a physician in the western province of Smolensk and then returned to Kyiv in 1918 during the Civil War and opened a small practice out of the family home. In early 1919, he was mobilized and sent to serve in the North Caucasus, after which he moved to Moscow and began his literary career. Operating out of his Moscow commune, quote, a repellent room in a repellent apartment, Bulgakov's confidence as a writer grew, and his self-proclaimed yearning for the past, the author composed a novel aimed at relating the tumultuous history of the Civil War years in his native city. So the 1917 revolutions and ensuing civil wars were calamitous, violent, and resulted in the displacement of millions across the former Russian Empire. The conflict was not simply between the revolutionary Bolshevik Reds and the white volunteer army defending the monarchy, but was comprised of several groups vying for power. The magnitude and chaos of these conflicts is deftly illustrated in the history of Kyiv from this period, which Bulgakov describes in his 1923 feuilleton, Kyiv the City. The wars, he writes, continued for 4 years. What happened during this time in the famous city defies any description. For 1,000 days, it thundered and bubbled and blazed with flame. Recounting the dizzying multitude of changes of power in the apocalyptic city over the war years, he writes, according to Kyivans, they had 18 coups. I can say for sure that there were 14 of them, and I personally experienced 10 of them. Jesting that only the Greeks did not come to Kyiv, Bulgakov relays the worst and least successful of the warring factions to rain terror on the city was the Ukrainian national cause, led by Simon Petlura, which he makes the subject of his first novel. The White Guard tells the story of the Turban family, the adult siblings, Alexei, Nikolai, and Elena, who are recently orphaned and living in their family home in Kyiv. The novel opens in spring 1918 with the death of the Turban mother, a parallel to the death of Bulgakov's own mother and a symbol of the death of the Russian Empire. For 8 months in 1918, Kyiv enjoys a period of relative peace and prosperity under a hetmanate of German forces allied with the White Army. The main action of the novel occurs in the winter months during the battle for Kyiv between White forces and the Ukrainian Directorate led by Petlura that take control of the city. Alexei and Nikolai serve in the White Army, and the former as a medic and the latter as a junior officer. The Turban house, kept warm and inviting by Elena, plays host to a cast of soldiers who stop through seeking refuge from the embattled winter streets. Alexei is wounded. He convalesces at the Turban home under Elena's care and miraculously recovers at the novel's end, which coincides with the Directory forces abandoning the city. The autobiographical parallels are clear, namely between the authorial hero Alexei and with the Turban house located at number 13 Alexeyevsky Descent, only a slight change to the street name of his biographical home. The novel was only partially published in serialized editions in 1925 before the publisher was shut down by the authorities. The clear affinities for white forces and the bourgeoisie lifestyles of the Russian intelligentsia were unpalatable in the nascent Soviet state. Nevertheless, wanting something unique, perhaps, the Moscow Art Theater commissioned Bulgakov to convert the story into a play. The play, titled The Days of the Turbans, ran briefly from 1926 to 29 to much popularity and critical outcry. The piece, as evident from the changed title, had undergone significant redactions to meet the ideological demands of the Soviet state. Despite the changes made, the play still solicited strong reactions. On the one hand, the play was criticized by contemporary Ukrainian playwrights for its unkind portrayal of the Ukrainian national cause for independence. On the other hand, it received criticisms from the Soviet authorities for its celebration of bourgeoisie. Moreover, the play's popularity seemed to be rooted in its capacity as an exercise in nostalgic catharsis for audiences across the Soviet sphere that, like Bulgakov, seemingly longed for the days of empire. It is well understood that Joseph Stalin, curiously, had an affinity for the play and had a role in its revival on the stage in the early 1930s. So running from 1932 to 40, the Days of the Turban staged over 900 performances, allowing the narrative to reach thousands before a version of the complete novel of the White Guard was finally published in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. So as Bulgakov grew as a popular figure, place-based memorialization practices dedicated to him took root in Moscow and Kyiv. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, more official forms of commemoration became possible, and several house museums were established in his honor. Founded in 1918, the Bulgakov Museum in Kyiv, located at 13 Andreevsky Descent, was restored to reflect in equal parts both the Bulgakov family biography and the story of the novel in a theatrically staged exhibition. The days in which the Turbans lived are revived. Visitors are brought to another world as they step off the hot summer streets of the city to a winter evening in 1918, cast in cool blue light. The display is largely devoid of text. Instead, the museum space and its things are described to visitors by a guide relaying the biography of the author and telling the story of the house through quotations from the novel. By featuring the color, the driving aesthetic is the whitewashing of all non-original items used to complete the restoration of the space, including walls, furniture, and objects. By featuring the color white so heavily, the museum not only delineates authentic objects from a recreated context, but also celebrates Bulgakov's use of color, of the color white, as a central trope in the novel and capitalizes on the resulting blank canvas for theatrical play with colored light. The museum's main exhibition capitalizes on the parallels between text and biography, recreating the world of the Russian intelligentsia in the early 20th century. The museum bases its restoration on the Bulgakov Turban home, on surviving family photographs, and the descriptions in the novel. The museum also emphasizes the house's dual identity through exterior markers, notably the double-sided address sign above the entryway that lists the two street names ascribed to the house, which you can see here. The museum also imparts traditional culture held by the Bulgakovs through visitor experiences, such as the optional post-tour tea time on the veranda and programming like the monthly Jour Fixe from the French fixed day, comprising of performances and celebrations of culture to lift one's spirits, which was a Bulgakov family tradition. So in short, the museum is unique, it's enjoyable to visit and rather popular given Bulgakov's international recognition and its location on one of the main historic thoroughfares of downtown Kyiv that is heavily trod by tourists. And this is me before I went to graduate school, so young and bright-eyed. In light of the ongoing war with Russia in Ukraine's eastern regions, the world has been made aware of the long legacy of Russian political, cultural, and military dominance over its neighbor. While the concept of a Ukrainian nation first emerged in the 19th century, as did many national ideas across Europe, Ukraine managed its first celebration of statehood briefly in the Civil War years. If we take Bulgakov's attitudes towards the Ukrainian national idea offered in the White Guard as typical of the average Russian of the time, then it is clear that the Russian state in its imperial and Soviet forms did not seriously consider the legitimacy of an independent and certainly not non-allegiant Ukrainian state. Upon the Union's dissolution, Ukraine did receive independence, but it was largely viewed as a nation divided between East and West with respective affinities to Russia and Europe. In 2014, the Euromaidan revolution and ensuing conflict with Russia proved a major watershed moment in boosting Ukrainian patriotism and prompting cultural and political activists to do away with the physical remnants of Russian and Soviet colonialism in the country. Lenin Pod, the felling of Lenin statues, swept across Ukraine and prompted conversations on the need for a larger rooting out of symbols of other powers occupying the nation. In 2015, a controversial series of so-called decommunization laws initiated the destruction of many monuments, mosaics, and architectural structures. As the cultural purge continued, eyes turned to more protected institutions that nevertheless uphold visions of great Russian chauvinism, and the Mikhail Bulgakov Memorial Museum made the list. The museum entering this discourse has little to do with the personal political views of the museum leadership or even the museum's mission, but more to do with the perception of Bulgakov as an indisputably Russian figure who besmirched the Ukrainian national cause. I should say that while the Bulgakov Museum comes up in these conversations, I think it is unlikely that extreme action would be taken against it because it is part of a greater network of museums under the umbrella of the History of Kyiv Museum. So it has some institutional protection there. But the rub, this uncomfortable relationship between the museum as a symbol and its community, is palpable. Anecdotally speaking, while I was in Ukraine and when I shared with others that I was working at the Bulgakov Museum, I was met with a variety of reactions, and rarely were they neutral. A lot of times I encountered rolling eyes and tisk-tisks to the effect of, don't you know that there are museums dedicated to Ukrainian writers? Why not work there? These reactions also speak to a very real issue of Ukrainian artists' long inability to be celebrated and not achieving recognition or popularity on the level of their Russian counterparts. So, to how the museum mitigates these issues. How does it respond to these criticisms from its local community? I find that the Bulgakov Museum mitigates the undesirable memory of its author in the current cultural landscape in Ukraine through its mission, narrative, and programming initiatives. The museum's mission is primarily to serve the local community by bringing attention to this world-renowned author's connection with Kyiv and Ukraine. And there's a statue of Bulgakov in front of the museum here, and you can see like school kids gathering in front of it, and it's good luck to rub the nose and the foot. The museum mitigates perceptions of Russian cultural dominance by featuring Ukrainian cultural programming, such as poetry readings in Ukrainian and folk music performances. So this was the celebration of New Year this January, pre-COVID, but they had a traditional Ukrainian band come and lead dances. So that was very fun. And then recently they also held a, oops, I don't know, how do I get out of this? Here we go. They held a competition for regional jam making. So they're tying together the museum's custom of tea with jam on the veranda and with Ukrainian regional culinary identity in a single celebration. And while the operating language of the museum behind administrative doors is generally Russian, museum leadership ensures that visitors to the museum can take a tour in Ukrainian, Russian, or English. And they recently they did audio guide recordings, which I got roped in as the English speaker. So if you ever find yourself on the Kyiv streets ducking into the museum, take a tour in audio guide in English, and that'll be me. And then also, as of now, their website is in Ukrainian only. In its exhibition narrative, the museum does not address Bulgakov's negative political views on the Ukrainian national cause. Instead, it emphasizes his struggle against the Soviet state as a censored and harassed writer who was unable to leave the Union, which is a narrative everyone kind of can get behind, right? This is also a point that is emphasized in their interactive theater program, Manuscripts Burn, in which one scene recreates the Soviet authorities raiding the author's apartment and destroying his writing, which is very dramatic. The museum also emphasizes the historical quality of the site, especially as it participates in the culture and aesthetic of one of the most heavily trod touristic thoroughfares in the nation's capital. To that point, the museum leans on the global appeal and popularity of Bulgakov. The library in the permanent exhibition prominently displays a shelf of Bulgakov's works translated into multiple languages. And every year, the museum celebrates the author's birthday with a multilingual reading of his works, which you can see pictured here. And this year, during the pandemic, they did recordings online that they posted to their Facebook page. In their efforts to stimulate a symbiotic cultural exchange between Ukraine and the rest of the world, the museum initiates international projects to increase visibility of the museum as a Ukrainian cultural institution and Bulgakov's connection with Ukraine. Recently, they successfully implemented a digital collection project as an open source platform with the libraries here at University of Michigan, which, as previously mentioned, was part of the work that I did as an intern there. So finally, I want to pose an observation where I find that the museum has actually utilized the motifs and themes of the White Guard in support of their pro-Ukrainian stance. So since Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2014, the official message of the museum stands, quote, in opposition to Russian aggression in Ukraine. One compelling, if not provocative, example of the museum's efforts to make Bulgakov a useful figure in this conflict is their mediation of an object from the novel in the museum that has been recast to speak to the current struggle. So in the white card, Bulgakov describes the family stove, a wall of white tiles, and its multiple inscriptions by family members over the course of 1918. The stove tiles function as a memory tableau of sorts, from which arise a polyphony of slogans, mementos, jokes, and banner phrases, which is quoted from the novel here. The museum recreates the turbine stove in their permanent exhibition that you can see here. And they also created their own version for visitors to sign as a sort of hybrid object of the museum's history. But then the stove tiles reappear, this time in a Facebook post made to the museum's official page in February 2020. The post features a picture from, quote, the front lines of an apartment interior prominently displaying a wall of white tiles with the same inscriptions and some drawings that Bulgakov lists in the white card. Notably, the stove tiles featured in the post are absent of the lines that evoke Russian patriotism and sentiments against the Ukrainian national cause that are part of the object that's described in the novel. Here, the tiles constitute an updated iconography of a Civil War struggle. In the foreground of the photo, we have an army jacket with embroidered patches featuring the Ukrainian flag and the phrase "Our Crimea." And then we have like a cat and an automatic rifle. And this is the post from the museum. Look what an interesting letter we received from the front lines. And this is the letter. This photo of the stove is the stove of the White Guard, but only by me, of the 72nd Brigade in the Zoloty region on the front line. It means a century has passed and no changes. Why study the two inscriptions to the top and the left? And these are the quotes from the White Guard about relying on allies. You can't do it. Allies are bastards. The letter ends and the museum says, "Thank you very much to our defenders. Thank you for your appreciation and warmth. We are always glad to see you at our house. Hashtag our Crimea, hashtag our Bulgakov." So piggybacking on this patriotic cry for the restoration of Crimea as Ukrainian territory, our Crimea, the museum fashions their own popular hashtag claiming Bulgakov as part of Ukrainian cultural identity, our Bulgakov. Here the museum highlights the parallels between the brutality of war, past and present, through the symbol of the stove, perhaps along the lines of Michael Rothberg's concept of multi-directional memory, wherein collective memories need not compete or operate under a zero-sum memorial regime, but can critically speak to one another across time and space. Here we see the museum's active attempt to bring together the lyrical realia of the White Guard to a critical space beyond the museum's walls, where Civil War memory from the early 20th century has the capacity to speak to the active construction of collective memory in Ukraine today. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion after.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you. This was fabulous. I just wanted to add a word about the structure of the event. So my thought was to continue with Felix's presentation and then discuss both presentations together. Now, I encourage all of you who already have questions for Grace to either note these questions down on a notebook or write them into the chat so that you don't forget your questions. Thank you, Grace. And now I invite Felix to present his talk.
Let's see if this works. All right, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. Well, first, thank you all for coming. Thanks for the Museum Studies program for putting this together. Thanks to Grace for her presentation. I'm really excited to present with her as we study this journey together. It's really exciting. So my presentation, as you can see, is entitled the 25 Years of Spanish Peace, Whitewashing Fascism Through Exhibitions in Francoist Spain. It will be mostly focusing on two exhibitions that occurred in Spain and in the United States during the year of 1964. But I'm going to start with a little bit of a background, just as Grace did. Let's see if this works. All right. So basically, this presentation explores the ways in which Spain and the US, to some extent, went from the picture on the left, that is Franco with Hitler in Endaya in 1940, in the French Basque Country, to the picture on the right. That is, as you can see, is a cover from Time magazine from the year 1966 that portrays Franco as this grandfather, not a fascist dictatorship. And so this presentation will deal mostly with two state-sponsored exhibitions from 1964 and the role in whitewashing the fascist nature of the Spanish state. Before moving on, I would like to draw your attention to the upper right corner of the Time magazine, where you guys can read "Spain looks to the future," as this is something that will come back later in the presentation. Just a little bit of background, a little bit of a Spanish history 101. Spain underwent a civil war between 1936 and 1939, which was the result of a military coup against the democratically elected government of the Second Republic, which prioritized to some degree a socialist-leaning agenda. There's a general estimate of 540,000 victims, including soldiers, victims of restoration, and other consequences of war, just as the dropping of the number of newborns at the time. An estimate of around 140,000 forced disappearances that put Spain to this day as the second country with the largest number of forced disappearance people. 50,000 executions in the period between 1939 and 1942, around 500,000 of exiled Spaniards, what you see at the top left is Madrid being bombarded in the year of 1936. The bottom left, you see male and female militia fighters on the march at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War in July of 1936. And in the bottom right, you see members of the International Brigades of Volunteers who went to Spain to fight against fascism. Around 50,000 people from all over the world joined their brigades. And what you can see there, in fact, is 2 Chinese volunteers, and I believe a French and a British volunteer. The last picture I wanted to show you to bring it home a little bit is a picture that I discovered thanks to Professor Julie Highfield. I see it's somewhere over there in the call. And that's a rally, the DIAC, at the University of Michigan in 1938, organized by the Progressive Club, a local chapter of the American Student Union that tried to mobilize the student union to connect with the international movement against fascism in Spain. Thanks to her, I know that 3 UMich students joined the international brigades, and more than 100 volunteers went from Michigan to Spain to fight against Franco. So why saying this in a presentation that deals with the 1960s? This brief contextualization is important to understand how the Civil War, despite its brutality and violence, became the quintessential source of political legitimacy of the dictatorship. Every single piece of political, visual, filmic, and literary discourse that argued for the, quote, legitimate government of the dictatorial state was founded upon 2 things. 1, a desire to rid of any shadow of illegitimacy of a state that resulted from a coup and a war, but also an attempt to situate the notion of victory at the very core of the political vocabulary of the state. Victory became the very reason of the legitimacy of the Francoist state, and more importantly, the war was turned into a untouchable and almost sacred piece in that vocabulary. Without exaggerating at all, we could say that the Spanish Civil War was an attempt to make Spain great again by bringing back the essential traits of Spanishness. So for the fascist army, they thought that Catholicism, the unity of Spain, not as a territory, but as a transcendental concept, and a desire to return to a grandiose notion of the past that encompassed a multitude of elements such as medieval notions of military leadership, the Catholic kings, or the colonial empire. On the left, what you see is a picture from the first Victory Parade of 1939. I want to point at the bottom of the picture where you see the Guardia Mora, or the Moroccan volunteers that went to Spain to fight with Franco. And to the left, you see a 1939 poster from the National Service of Propaganda that reads, "First Crusade, Spain is the spiritual compass of the world." So you can see how the war had a very religious element to the fascist state. So in a way, we could say that the past took over the present in Spain at the time. And historical time, or at least the discourse about history, froze in its obsession with an idyllic past. The discourse saw in the past, this discourse saw in the past a repository of moral values that had to be brought back for the salvation of the country in the present and to prevent the destruction of the unity of Spain. This notion of unity represents the key concept of the politics of history in post-war Spain. And despite the fact that, despite the obvious social division caused by the Civil War, the conflict itself became the binding element of the national unity as the collective experience of liberation from the Red Terror. So what you see this is a footage from the Milenario de Castilla. It's the 1000th anniversary of the birth of Castile that was celebrated in Spain in 1944. And I wish I had more pictures of it because you really could see how they put together like a medieval tournament as a way of celebrate the birth of Castile. But I think if there is one picture that really explains this idea of the time of history, like freezing in Spain, is this painting from see if it, oh, there it is. This painting from Bolivian artist Arturo Reque. And that's Franco there, right? And you see how there's this desire to like bring back not only the medieval appearances of Franco as a medieval knight, but also a Baroque aesthetics. And so time and history, in a way, as I was saying, froze after the war, and became this like asphyxiating presence in post-war Spain. So the obsession with the past in Spain kind of went into crisis with the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, right? Spain obviously fought with the Axis and was on the side of the Axis. And so Spain was in dire need of money and political support after being banned from the United Nations until 1950, when thanks to the support of the US, Spain was recognized as a member. In 1953, the US and Spain signed the Pact of Madrid that established US military bases in Spain in exchange for a whopping $544 million, along with investments in the country and political support that led to the admission of Spain to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Spain became, in a way, fashionable. At this time, it's when all the movie stars and all the Hollywood stars would start to go to Madrid, and Spain became like this exotic place for the US. And most importantly, Spain became a strong ally of the US as technically the only country that had defeated communism. At the same time, the Spanish government started to substitute military members of the cabinet with economists or technocrats. And similarly, the image of Franco became progressively more civilian in nature. The picture that you see there is Franco painting. They said that he liked to paint it. And so I want to go back to this idea of Spain looks to the future, because the conceptual figure of the future became, for Spain, immediately attached to two notions. One, democracy via the United States, in opposition to the dictatorial nature of the USSR, and science as a symbol of progress. To highlight the alleged democratic nature of Spain, the dictatorship celebrated in 1964 the 25 years of Spanish peace. This year-long celebration included a plethora of publications, movies, and more importantly, exhibitions. Can you see the there? Sorry. So the 25 years of Spanish peace. So this year-long celebration included publications, movies, and more importantly, exhibitions, both in Spain and abroad. What you're seeing there is the official poster of the celebration, so to speak. It's a poster was designed by Julian Santamaria, and it's important to show it because this is the first piece of political advertising that the dictatorship translated to all the now co-official languages of the country. So you see the first version, the top one is in Catalan, the one in the middle is in Galician, and the one in the bottom is in Basque. This is very important because the dictatorship was very violent against any other national identities within Spain and imposed Castilian and Castilian history as the quote, true language and identity of the country. So from now on, I will be focused on these two exhibitions. One was entitled España 64, Spain 64, and the Pavilion of Spain in the New York World Fair of 1964. So the exhibition España 64 consisted of a 1,500 square meter deployable pavilion filled with large-scale panels portraying the material progress of the country through statistics, graphs, and charts. España 64 traveled around the country and displayed a discourse based on what the catalog defined as the quote, the cold eloquence of numbers, and could be seen as an effort to project an image of the state as a producer of material and economic progress, framed here through what was presented as objective data. I define this intersection between data and visual artifacts in Franco's Spain as an example of a sort of an aesthetics of objectivity, where science appear here as the neutral judge of the work of the state and the images and data as the silent byproducts of this judgment. The target of the exhibition was to avoid, and this is a quote from a memo from the government, praise of any kind, to prevent the public from considering as propaganda material and hence rebuffing it out of hand without reading it. It has to be the same readers who reach their own conclusions at the sight of the facts. It is crucial to understand how an exhibition like this one produced a discursive space where the visitor had the choice, supposedly, the choice to decide whether to believe or not the facts that were presented. In my analysis of España 64, I understand this exhibition as a virtual context of democracy in a country where press and media at the time were in near absolute control of the state. The possibility of creating an experience for the visitor that technically could decide whether or not to believe was groundbreaking. Something very interesting to me about this exhibition that has not been studied previously, and I'm very proud to say that I'm the first one publishing the images that you guys can see in the presentation. Something very interesting is that despite the known dictatorial character of Spain under Franco, España 64 presented the country as a democracy. And what you can see in this panel on the left is a picture of the Spanish Congress at the time. But more importantly, this democracy, this organic democracy, that's the word that the dictatorship used, was one in a country that was united by progress, growth, and modernity. So we go from seeing the war and the violence of the war as a unifying nature to now seeing progress, growth, and modernity. What you can see in the picture on the left is a close-up of the panel that says, hace 25 años que venimos votando lo mismo, which translates like, we've been voting for the same thing for the last 25 years. And that you can see the vote, and the vote, it reads peace. And to the right, you see a picture from the catalog that highlights this idea of Spain being united by the peace and the progress brought by Franco. Virtually at the same time, this was like a few months, in New York, the Spanish Pavilion at the World Fair opened its doors and became one of the most celebrated buildings of the fair, and received actually numerous awards while the fair was open. The pavilion was designed and created by architect Javier Carvajal. In the context of a world fair so strongly focused on the notion of future, if you guys have read about the 1964 fair, you know, this was very, very, very impacted by the prospect of space exploration, right? So in the context of a fair so focused on the future, the Pavilion of Spain focused on presenting a retrospective narrative in which the notion of culture provided a fertile ground for marketing the exoticism and otherness of Spain in the eyes of the US. Long gone in the pavilion were the days of fascism, autarky, and the asphyxiating presence of the past, and the war as symbols of national unity. These were substituted by an understanding of culture as a conflict-free collection of objects devoid of any context, which were marketed only as examples of a grandiose culture for which history provided simply a container. The pavilion exhibited works of art from the great masters of Baroque paintings, Zurbarán, Velázquez, etc., and even some works from Picasso and Miró, despite their opposition against the regime. They even displayed works by Federico García Lorca, who was actually murdered at the beginning of the Civil War by the fascist army. This was presented together with traditional forms of artistry from the different regions of the country, religious arts, contemporary art, and traditional food. So the curatorial narrative of the pavilion focused on how these objects represented the cultural unity of Spain. Culture, or rather here the concept of national culture, became the binding element of the nation in the eyes of US citizens avid for novelty, excitement, and different places to visit. Not for nothing, during this time, Spain became the tourist hotspot that it still is today. So this unifying aspect of national culture was presented throughout the pavilion through the symbol of the pomegranate that you could see at the bottom in pink. The pomegranate was a symbolic representation of the Emirate of Granada. Granada is the Spanish for pomegranate, the last territory annexed after the Reconquista in 1492. The logo of the pomegranate was incorporated throughout the building and as the logo of the pavilion as the symbol of unity. And this is an excerpt from a promotional pamphlet of the pavilion. When the Catholic kings took over the kingdom of Granada, they added the pomegranate to our coat of arms. And you can see the coat of arms at the bottom of the coat of arms. Spain was this way complete, ready to overflow its destiny beyond its borders. Queen Isabella sent her ships to discover new lands, and her hands discovered a whole new world. The pomegranate is the symbol of our unity, our destiny, and the biggest enterprise of our history. The sculpture that you see to the left is a sculpture of Queen Isabella, made by sculptor Jose Luis Sanchez. And in its hands, as you can see at the bottom center, there's this abstract pomegranate open. And the sculpture was at the entrance of the pavilion, so it was the first thing that people would see. So at the pavilion, the unifying nature of the war as the binding element of the political identity of the fascist state was substituted with a discourse on the past, and more importantly, the Spanish Empire, as the main historical agent that made Spain a unified country. It is important to keep in mind that the motto of the dictatorship was Spain, one, grand, and united. By switching the war for the colonial past, the dictatorship not only connected with the colonial origin of the US, but also whitewashed fascism through history as the cohesive element of the country. In conclusion, the exhibitions España 64 and those of the pavilion in New York were two essential assets for the dictatorship in their attempt to reframe notions of national unity and identity. But more importantly, these two exhibitions were crucial for the dictatorship to distance itself from its fascist past and move away from a political legitimacy based on the violence of the war to one founded upon the material results of its policies, its progress, and national culture as the safeguard, as the new safeguard of national unity. As a perhaps interesting ending to the presentation, the pavilion was purchased by Alfonso Juan Cervantes, who was the mayor of Missouri at the time in 1964. It was taken to St. Louis and it was put up there as a Spanish club that went bankrupt in 1 year. And now it's the Hilton Hotel. So the building is still alive. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. Both of you have given us a lot to think with. I would say we aim for at least 5 more minutes for everybody who can stay, so that we have approximately 15 minutes to discuss your talks. You can raise your hand or put something into the chat or unmute yourself. So who would like to start the conversation? Peter.
I actually have a question, one for Grace and one for Felix, and they both, I'm interested in sort of historical trajectories. And I think they're maybe simple questions, but I'm still curious to hear what you might say and the place of museums in the things that you were talking about. For Grace, I'm curious to hear more about I guess the inscription of this Ukrainian national story into this museum. I'm just curious what it looked like before Russian aggression, before some of the latest sort of developments in the Ukrainian identity, or before independence maybe. I'm not familiar with the museum, so I'm curious to hear more about its sort of earlier state and sort of what the remaking of it, in terms you showed us, might look like. And with Felix, I'm curious, actually going in the other direction. And one thing I've understood about Spain, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that after Franco had died, that one thing that led to a peaceful transition to something like democracy was a consensus of not to retouch the Civil War. And I'm curious to see that this shift you're already pointing to, is this something that sort of carries over and has an impact later in this sort of later set of development? So those are the two questions I had.
Grace?
Yeah, great. Good to see you, Peter. Thank you for attending and for your question. I think it's a really poignant one, and one probably I should explore more, because my personal experience with the museum does start in 2014, when we kind of see this new effort maybe really articulating and expressing, right, their Ukrainian patriotism and sort of rewriting their narrative. Just from my general knowledge of post-Soviet culture in Ukraine and Kyiv, Russian was actually very acceptably the cosmopolitan language, and Ukrainian or Surdushik, like the mixed language, was still kind of considered country or bumpkin. And that only really sort of started changing, slowly over the course of the 90s and early 2000s. And perhaps another watershed moment would be the presidency of Yushchenko and the 2004 Orange Revolution. And he actually, people kind of refer to him as a museums president. Like, he really used museums as an institution for promoting Ukrainian culture and solidifying Ukrainian culture on the, in Ukraine's landscape. As far as how the Bulgakov Museum fits into this, to me, I'm not very sure. I feel like perhaps for a very long time, they just kind of kept more to a Russian culture, museum culture, and it was maybe even a little more insular. So I'll investigate that more, because definitely in terms of museum leadership, some people identify more as Ukrainian than others, and that comes out in a personal way, but to the extent it came out in the museum's programming and narrative is actually unclear to me. So I do think that's kind of critical to see how before 2014, how the museum developed itself in this regard. So thank you for your question.
Thanks, Peter, for your question. I think it's funny that you mentioned that, because this project, which is one of the chapters of the dissertation, is a twofold project. After a study of the year 1964, there goes an in-depth analysis of the year 1966. And to me, it is the year 1966 is crucial to really understand the repercussions of the transition to democracy in Spain. So basically the story, or the mainstream story, goes like Franco dies, and there's a government, the transitional government, that decides that consensus is the basis for a new democracy. And there's this alleged pact of silence, where the government and the nation decided that the war was not to be touched anymore, and that we should not talk about it anymore. My analysis of that process, and usually it's a view that really focuses on the period between 1975 and the death of Franco in 1978 and the new constitution, the democratic constitution. To me, this is a process that starts in 1966. I think that the transition to democracy that we lived in Spain was, and this is a historical fact, was something that was produced by the Francoist state very much quite earlier on. And so if I just wanted to show you this picture that I had in my presentation of Franco voting in 1966. In 1966, the government put together this referendum. It was a referendum on a new constitution, and that constitution, the text of the constitution establishes, I think it ends with a sentence that to me is so fascinating, which says, "After Franco, the institutions." And so what happened, what I analyze is that 1966 and these kind of whitewashing of the fascist past were the first steps to make of the state a structure that could survive without Franco, to later on become a democracy. And so I think what I'm trying to do is, in my project, is trying to think of the transitional period before it happened and why it happened the way it happened. And I think that in order to do that, we have to look at the 60s.
Thank you. I mean, we see in both of your answers, but also in the presentations, I was really struck by the careful mediations and shifts that you're both proposing, and I was struck, Felix, by the visual language of the Pavilions exhibition that really references pre-World War II agitprop exhibition aesthetics that we saw both in Europe but also in Russia. So, you know, it's really, and you see that, I think you see that in a different way also in Kiev. The immense crossover of visual aesthetics and exhibition design, and the extreme malleability of this form to make it fit, to contemporary politics. Yeah, Felix, is that something that you probably also saw, that these visual references?
Yeah, I think, you know, in the case of the pavilion, what was really interesting to me is how the discourse on history through the objects that were presented was really not that different from the things that, you know, pre-World War II Francoism would highlight. You know, I think there's the crown of Queen Isabella, and there's the sword from El Cid, and there's these like there were a lot of like medieval religious and objects. So in terms of a certain politics of history, it was not that different from pre-1945, pre-World War II. But the way it was presented, I think it was so new to US audiences. This was one of the first, if not the first, Francoist pavilion outside of Spain in a world fair of these size, right? That, you know, all of that context, all of that information, all of that ideological tone was kind of missing. And so, and to me, and where I find it like present is through the symbol of the pomegranate, you know, going back to this idea of Spain being united, Spain being an idea that transcends territory, and that you can also find in the US, right? Before and after the fair, Spain and the US had like many cultural missions and many cultural projects that were done together, especially recuperating the colonial past and colonial architecture in Florida, for instance, in California. And so, you know, it was this like revival of colonial Spain that in the 60s was so fascinating for the US. But to me, it was like sleeping under the obviousness of it. It was sleeping all the ideological ideas of fascist Francoism.
Grace, do you wanted to add something to it, or in response? No. Okay. Do we have one more question? For me, the color of white is also something that connects both of your presentations in very interesting ways. So for Felix, you know, the whitewashing of history, or the washing away of, it's just mind-boggling to me. I really have to take a while to think through that, how successful the Franco regime actually was before Franco died in doing this cultural work. And then the color of white in your presentation, Grace, has a very different connotations. You know, you have the white guard, so you have the historical reference there, but then you also have this interesting exhibition aesthetic that uses the color of white in differentiating between original, authentic objects and reproductions. And I thought that was really an interesting way to convey the constructiveness of this historical space, or the reconstruction of this historical space. But then you link that back to the nostalgia for the Russian Empire. So yeah, that was very fascinating. So it's more a comment, but if you have anything else to add to that, to the work that white does in the Bulgakov Museum.
Sure, yeah. Like you said, it's this motif in the novel, and it's not just the white army, but the city is covered in snow, and lots of references. Something that's a sacred part of the Bulgakov of the Turban House, right, is the cream curtains that sort of protect it from the outside world. And so all these symbols also kind of tie into the everyday life of the Russian intelligentsia that is lost. And I agree. I think this what the museum achieves in their restoration, because having studied a lot of author houses, usually there's more of a straightforward attempt at restoration of the space. And here they draw attention to it. And I think that increases this feeling of nostalgia, because you know that everything in white, and there aren't just, pieces of furniture, but a canary in a cage and a guitar on a chair and a plant, a house plant. And so these things feel like even farther away from us. So it's really, like I say, it's very theatrical and quite impactful. So it's certainly something very unique that they execute, I think, very successfully.
Well, thank you again, Felix and Grace, for these fantastic presentations. And thank you all for coming, for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend all together. Thank you.
Thank you.